Well, a big thank you for those lovely introductions. Thank you, Professor Suji, and thank you, Jeff. That was a really lovely introduction. And so an absolute pleasure to be here. I was a bit stunned when I came in the door and I saw the little sign on the door describing me as a distinguished alumna of Essex. I'm not sure any of my lecturers back in the 1980s would have envisaged me coming back as a distinguished alumna, but it's really lovely to be received so warmly, and lovely to be back here as a returning Essex graduate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about global displacement and the overall context and the role that international law plays in that landscape, and share a few thoughts on that. But I thought I would first of all just say a few words about my own journey and the role that Essex played in that journey. So I indeed came to Essex in the late 1980s. I came from Northern Ireland, so it was quite a tough environment to grow up in. It was a conflict, a situation in which conflict was very much playing out. It was felt like quite an inward-looking environment. And one of the things that I experienced when I came to Essex, and I think is still very evident now, was just that wider sense of Essex within the world and the international context in which Essex was existing at that time. It was a tough time. It was the late 1980s, so this was Thatcher's Britain. This was a time of social division and inequality. And what I loved about Essex was just how socially engaged it was as a student body, as a university, and I think that has still very much remained the case until today. I had a great time. It was a lot of fun. I have very long-standing friendships from my time here at Essex, not only among the other law students, but also from other faculties. And I would say that I still have half a dozen very, very close friends today from those years as an undergraduate. And they were also all really thrilled to hear that I'd be coming back and having the chance to speak to you. When I came to study law, I didn't have a clear vision of what that would lead to. I wasn't 100% sure that I would end up being a lawyer. But I would say that by the end of the 4 years here, I did the English and French law degree, as has been explained. And I think by the end of my time here, I was starting to have a sort of an emerging kind of sense of direction and purpose. I think the first element of that was the connection to the European context and the international context, as I've said, but also an interest in public international law. So I was an undergraduate. I wasn't on the LLM. It was the very early days of the LLM. But some of that thinking and some of the elements of that expertise in human rights was also finding its way into the undergraduate teaching. So being able to study international law, being able to study with professors like Françoise Hampson, was just a really wonderful starting point, I think for me. And it also meant that as a graduate, I think we came out very attuned to the importance of thinking about law and how it plays out in a wider social context. So having that sort of expertise and the doctrinal expertise is really, really important, but actually what matters is how law is applied and how rights are realised in practice. So that was very much something I took away with me. So I left Essex with what was a really great education, allowed me to enter the legal profession, train as a barrister, go and work for the Refugee Legal Centre, as Jeff mentioned. And I think it also instilled in me this kind of openness to opportunities, which I think has been something that has been very much present through my career. It also instilled the desire to work in an international context, and it also instilled in me the desire to work on an issue or on issues that really felt meaningful to me personally. And that was what eventually then led me to UNHCR. It didn't happen right away. I worked here in the UK for almost 10 years, but eventually had the opportunity to join UNHCR initially as a consultant in quite a legal role, and then that opened up a wider set of opportunities for me. So where did it all start? It started indeed with a short consultancy in Pakistan. So I was brought in as one of a team to basically work on delivering training, helping build capacity on refugee law, on refugee status determination, asylum, for government officials in Pakistan and also UNHCR staff in Pakistan. So I went in quite a legal role, still quite an office-based role. And while I was in Pakistan, on what was envisaged, I think it's quite a short-term consultancy arrangement, 9/11 happened. And all of a sudden, everything was kind of flipped on its head. And all of a sudden, this massive crisis was kind of taking shape in different places around the world in different ways. I was in Peshawar, right on the border with Afghanistan, and we knew very, very quickly that there was going to be a very large-scale refugee crisis, that people would start coming across the border from Afghanistan into Pakistan. It had become clear very, very quickly that there would be a US response to what had happened. There would be a bombing of Afghanistan. The Taliban government was then in power, the first Taliban, and so the whole operation changed. And instead of being this kind of quite static operation, we were looking at the niceties of refugee law, who fulfilled the refugee definition, who didn't. Suddenly, it was about getting ready to receive a very large influx of refugees. And for those of us who were there, we essentially had to make a choice as to whether we wanted to stay and become engaged in this big emergency operation, or whether it was time to conclude our contracts and go back home and go back to work. And it was a really difficult decision. It really felt like taking a step into the unknown, into a very uncertain situation, and somehow the balance tipped in favour of staying, and that was really what brought me into UNHCR and what brought me into what has really been an incredible privilege to be working for the organisation, working with refugees over the last 25 years. So indeed, I became part of that big emergency response operation. We soon had very large numbers of people arriving. It was very chaotic. People coming across the border, families separated, children separated from their parents, people very traumatized, arriving exhausted in very, very unfamiliar surroundings, a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, and something just was beyond my experience at the time. And we were there very much working as a team, working as part of the UNHCR team, but also working with local government officials, working with the NGOs on the ground. That was both local Pakistani NGOs, but also international NGOs, and really in that kind of race against time to get in those days it was camps along the border, get the camps set up, get the shelter in place, get the services in place. For me as a lawyer, I was very involved in the setting up the registration system, so people were properly registered, were given a documentation that showed they had a status in the country, and identifying people who were particularly vulnerable, who perhaps needed special assistance. And it really, it was quite a very, very dramatic experience, I think, for all of us who were involved. So that brought me into UNHCR, and you've heard a little bit about the different places where I've worked. I've always had a bit of a mix between headquarters roles and roles in the field operations, which is something that has really has really worked for me. And I think one of the reasons I'm still working with UNHCR 25 years on is because of the very unique mandate and the very unique role that UNHCR has. It's a mandate that's rooted in international law. So we are the office of the High Commissioner for Refugees. That's an office that was established in the 1950s, just after the Second World War, and it was very much a response to what had happened in the 1930s when people had not been able to flee Nazi Germany, had not been welcomed, many had been turned back, had not been given refuge. But it was also a response to the very large numbers of displaced people that were in Europe and indeed across the world at the end of the war, and who needed solutions. So the mandate was and is to provide international protection to refugees and to work to find solutions for refugees and for refugee situations. And that mandate resides in the High Commissioner. So our High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, is just coming up to the end of his 10-year term as High Commissioner. So we're waiting to hear who his successor is going to be. And we are all the office of the High Commissioner, essentially. So that's where the mandate comes from. Over the years, we've also had additional responsibilities added. So we have responsibilities for internally displaced people, and we also have responsibilities for stateless people as well, as an organisation. We're a UN agency, which means we work with governments. So a lot of our work is about the relationships with governments, and it's governments at the end of the day that have to provide the protection that refugees need, whether that's through legal frameworks or policies or different ways of implementing that responsibility. So we work with governments, but we are also very operational. So we are present in the locations where refugees are present, essentially. And that means we work in around 130 countries around the world. We have, I think we're about 15,000 staff now. Our staffing has been reduced quite significantly over the last year or so, but we're at about 15,000. We're headquartered in Geneva, but the majority of our staff are in the field operations. And not necessarily in capital cities. It's very much in the locations where the refugees are located. We're a humanitarian organisation that's built into our statute. We are non-political. However, we are operating in situations and working on issues that are inherently very political. So navigating that as a humanitarian, non-political agency can sometimes be very, very challenging. And we have to navigate those politics. We have to be attuned to the political environments we're working in. We have to be attuned to how the politics are shaping government actions and the space that gives to governments. So in terms of our protection work, it takes different forms in different situations. So it sometimes means very technical, legal work, working on refugee law, working on policy, advising on national legislation, developing guidelines, all of that. But it can also mean essentially being a negotiator, being at a border where refugees are arriving and negotiating entry for refugees, working with local officials. So it can be very hands-on, very, very on the ground. I've mentioned registration. That's incredibly important, something UNHCR has a very key role in often. Sometimes governments do it, sometimes we do it together with governments. But when refugees arrive, making sure they have some kind of documentation that they're registered, because often people are arriving with no documentation, no civil documentation. It may have been lost or they haven't had time to bring it with them. So the legal status, registration, and then we deliver protection services, protection programs. So that could be through legal aid, it could be through special protection programs, child protection, services for survivors of gender-based violence. So that, when we talk about UNHCR's protection role, it's that whole host of different ways of working and intervening. Our role is underpinned by a wider legal framework that some of you may be familiar with. So at the same time as the statute of UNHCR was being developed, there was also work underway to develop an international legal framework for the protection of refugees, and that culminated in the development of the Refugee Convention, which was adopted in 1951. And that was, I think, not only a legal milestone, but also very much a moral milestone. It was really the first time that essential principle that no one should be returned or pushed back to a situation where their life or their fundamental rights would be threatened. That fundamental principle was really enshrined in international law, and it was the first universal legal instrument that defined who is a refugee and then set out this set of rights that were associated with refugee status. A really important element of the convention appears in the preamble, and it's essentially a recognition that to respond and address the challenges of refugee movements, international cooperation was absolutely critical. And that principle of international cooperation underpins everything that the Refugee Convention is about. And that principle that responsibility for refugees needs to be shared. And that's how protection is delivered in practice. And that's really underscored in the convention. But the convention talks about rights, but it also has a number of other provisions. It also talks about the interests of states, and it makes references to national security. It makes references to situations where someone can be excluded from the protection of the convention. Even if they fit the criteria, they can be excluded because of particular acts they may have committed. Jeff is the leading expert on this. And it also sets out the circumstances in which refugee status can be seized if someone is no longer in need of international protection, and particularly if the situation in their country has fundamentally and durably changed. UNHCR is specifically mentioned in the convention. We have a supervisory responsibility, and it is among the most highly ratified of international conventions. So it has 149 states that are party to the convention, or the protocol to the convention, or both. And even where states are not party to the convention, what we see, and this is what I saw in Pakistan, for example, the convention, the principles and the standards set out in the convention do provide an inspiration, if you like, for how those states respond to refugee crises. So when I was in Pakistan, we were working on the basis of a memorandum of understanding signed between UNHCR and the government, which essentially adopted the refugee definition and provided a status based on that definition. It's also been incorporated and reflected in national laws. There have been regional conventions developed in Africa, declaration for Latin America. You have the Common European Asylum System. All these have essentially built on that underlying framework of the 1951 Refugee Convention. I'm going to just make 3 observations. The first observation is that in the very complex, unstable environment in which we find ourselves today, that need for international cooperation to address refugee flows, to address forced displacement, is more compelling than ever, I would say. When I joined UNHCR 25 years ago, there were around 38 million people displaced globally as a result of conflict and violence and persecution. So that was 25 years ago. And today, that number has tripled. So we're now at a figure of 117 million people forcibly displaced globally, which is quite staggering. And so we have refugees, internally displaced people across every region. Around a third of the figure are refugees, so people who've crossed international borders seeking protection elsewhere, and around 2/3 of that number are internally displaced within their own countries. And that's essentially a consequence of the number of active conflicts that we have in the world today. It currently stands at 130, according to the ICRC. So 130 active conflicts globally, and that's up from in just a year, that's up from 120. So it gives you a bit of a sense of where we are. The consequences are very direct. People killed, people forced to flee. And what we see, of course, is that conflict is one element, but it's compounded by factors like climate change, like food insecurity, poverty, inequality. Climate in particular, I would say, acts as a sort of multiplier. And it's increasingly a factor in displacement today. And climate also makes it harder to find solutions because 80% of refugees are in countries that are considered as facing high to extreme exposure to climate hazards. So for refugees, then finding solutions, being able to move back home becomes very difficult. The number of conflicts obviously is a symptom of a major crisis in the international system, and the inability to prevent conflict, to resolve conflict, is creating this proliferation of conflicts. And then, of course, we're also seeing wars really being defined nowadays by indiscriminate violence, by disregard of international humanitarian law. We've seen that in Gaza. We've seen it very recently in Al-Fashir in Sudan. When we think about refugee crises, I think the big ones that come to mind are crises like Ukraine, 9.4 million people displaced, but there are also many crises that are less visible. And one that is very much at the forefront of our minds in UNHCR at the moment is in Mozambique, where we've had conflict in the north of the country. We've had around 100,000 people displaced in just 2 weeks. And that's coming on top of a displacement situation that's been evolving over the last 7 years. So 1.3 million people already displaced there. And we also have a number of long-standing refugee and displacement situations, which are either not resolved, or they take on new dimensions over time, or there are recurrent crises within crises. One that is very present in my mind is the situation in Myanmar. That's somewhere I worked about 10 years ago. I worked in the southeast of the country. At the moment we're seeing internal displacement really across the country, but we're also seeing new refugee outflows into Bangladesh, and that's a very long-standing big refugee situation, and we're not seeing a lot of progress towards any prospect of resolution. The consequences of all these crises are they're not shared, they're not experienced uniformly across the world. Around 2/3 of refugees are hosted in their own regions or in countries next to their own. And around 70% of refugees are hosted by low-income countries, middle-income countries, often in border areas, often in areas that are struggling with their own development challenges or are also impacted by the security implications of having a conflict next door. So, for example, I think of a country like Chad. Chad, over the last year and a half or so, has experienced a massive influx of refugees from Sudan, and is very much struggling to manage that. And in the last year alone, around 250,000 refugees arriving. In the UK, we get very concerned about 40,000 people arriving on small boats, but I think compared to the massive consequences that refugee movements are having elsewhere, I think one has to put that in proportion. In general, countries do keep their borders open, we find, to refugees, and it's often local communities who are the first to respond. That's not only because of legal obligations. In fact, I probably would say it's not even at all because of legal obligations. It often is about very long-standing traditions of hospitality, of offering sanctuary. But what we do see is that over time, that hospitality and that generosity can be challenged, and particularly if those countries don't receive the sufficient support. And I've already mentioned the impact of massive refugee arrivals in regions that are really experiencing their own development challenges. Returns of refugees, unfortunately, are the exception rather than the norm. We have started to see some openings emerging in Syria, for example. So we've seen a number of returns to Syria from countries in the region, from Jordan, from Lebanon, from Turkey. So over 1 million refugees have gone back since the fall of the previous regime almost a year ago. But we're also, unfortunately, increasingly seeing forced returns as well. And that's in particular happening in Afghanistan at the moment. Second point I want to make is that this kind of bargain, this principle of international cooperation and this principle of solidarity that underpins the international protection system is really being fundamentally challenged at the moment. There is a bit of a sense that the structures and the institutions that have been built up over decades have become quite distant. They're no longer meeting the challenges of the modern world, and there's a bit of a loss of trust, including in multilateral institutions, including in the United Nations. Another element is that we have really failed, I think, internationally to get to grips with what it means to provide protection to people who move beyond their immediate regions. So as we said, most refugees do stay in their immediate regions, but for those who move beyond, often alongside migrants who are moving for other reasons, there has been really a collective failure, I would say, in that front. We are seeing, and we have seen for many years in Europe, in North America, elsewhere, a response which is really about barriers, interception, and this kind of architecture of exclusion that has grown up. And then more recently, international law being called into question, the Refugee Convention being called into question, and maybe in the Q&A we can talk a bit more about how that's playing out here in the UK. There's a bit of a crisis of public confidence, I would say, around asylum systems and around the legal frameworks and the ability of the legal frameworks to deliver. And then another element of that is that the support to refugee hosting countries is declining. We all, I think, we all know about the funding cuts from the US, but it's not only the US, it's also European governments, including the UK, who have reduced their overseas aid. And that has a massive impact on the countries that are hosting refugees. It has a massive impact on organisations like UNHCR and the other aid organisations that are trying to respond. So, what is the way forward? I think our approach is very much, we have to hold on to what we have. We have to hold on to the international instruments, and we need more consistent application, more committed application of the instruments. We need to see the convention as a blueprint to build on, not something that should be thrown aside at this point. And we need to really start approaching the movement of refugees as a kind of a whole of route challenge. So that means investing in the countries of first asylum. It means engaging with refugees who do move onwards along the routes where they're moving and not waiting until they present themselves at borders and in the UK, for example, and offering alternatives and offering safe, regular pathways for refugees to move instead of leaving them in the hands of smugglers and traffickers. Regional cooperation, really important. The UK arrangement with France is an example of that. It's an approach that UNHCR very much supports. There is a sense and a perception that the arrival of refugees, of asylum seekers in small boats, for example, in the UK, a sense that there is a loss of control there, and there is a real imperative, I think, of governments working together to manage those situations in a much more effective way. So look, I've talked about the challenges. I've presented a pretty bleak picture, but I do believe there's a way forward. I've started to say a little bit about that. But I also want to say that there are successes to celebrate as well. And I think those really lie in the values, in the empathy that we see in local responses to refugees around the world. I mentioned my last assignment was in Syria. That was a country that had now very much impacted, by a decade of conflict, but in the past was actually a country that welcomed refugees, and in particular refugees from Lebanon during their own civil war. And I remember being in a village in Lebanon and talking to a villager there and asking why he was hosting dozens of Syrians literally in his property. And he said, it's a matter of history and it's a matter of heart. And I think what that means is that the law you study here, the law that we work with as UNHCR, is not abstract. It is something that is living, it's something that shapes lives, and it means that what we do, what you say, defending rights and shaping narratives, and building trust in institutions, that matters. So Essex, I think, gave me a lot of things. It gave me the tools to navigate a very complex world. And my hope for you as students is that it will do the same for you.